just be who we are. Help us to not try to lift ourselves up above others, but also help us to not feel as if we're without value. But help us to just rest in your love, that you delight in us, and that we can focus not on building ourselves up, but on building up those around us. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Well, I want to start by, as I read the readings for this week, thinking about what to say. One of my favorite characters in the Bible came to mind. And for some reason, I'm not sure what connects me with this guy in the Bible, but there's just something, I'm not sure what the connection point is, but it's Mark in the New Testament. I'm not sure why that gets my attention when I read through there, but it also gets my attention when I sort of see his story. That Mark was someone who we first read about him when Peter is arrested in the book of Acts, and there's a prayer meeting at his mother's house. So we know that he's part of a faithful family. We know he's got connections. We find out he's a cousin of Barnabas, who's going to be a traveling companion with the Apostle Paul. So he gets some connections early on. And one of those connections is he gets to go on the first missionary trip with Paul and Barnabas. But does Mark do really well on that first missionary trip, if you are familiar? Mark basically goes and things get difficult and he chickens out and he goes home. And so when Paul and Barnabas, or when Paul wants to go on another missionary trip, Barnabas says, okay, I'll get my cousin Mark again. And what does Paul say? No, he chickened out. I don't trust him. I don't want him. But does Mark basically just disappear at that point? Has he failed and never to recover again? No, if you keep on reading later in Paul's life as he's writing, he says, go and get Mark, because he is useful to us. And he apparently became very useful because he was involved in writing the book of Mark. So when I think of my own life, I think about how early on in life I could really relate to Mark, because I was someone who chickened out all the time. Anything that I thought I'd fail at, I didn't try. Anything that was a challenge, I didn't try. I just basically stood on the sideline and watched a lot of stuff. But as I've gotten older, I've gotten a lot more courageous in trying things. Because really, I want Mark's story to be like my story. I want my story to be that even though I maybe was fickle early on, or maybe made mistakes early on, or didn't follow through on things early on, I want my life to be known for finishing well. And I guess that's why Mark came to mind as I was reading the scriptures for this week. Because in our reading from 2 Timothy, I think that book, that letter, is really a lot about encouraging people to finish well. Because Timothy was another person who was part of Paul's traveling team as he did missionary journeys. But Timothy also, he started out well, but he got to the place where he was getting discouraged, where there was a possibility that Timothy wasn't going to end well too, that he'd just get discouraged and give up. So Paul is writing this letter to say, let me encourage you, Timothy. Let me remind you of the family you're from, the belief that your community has in you, the trust that I and the other leaders have in you. Let me remind you of all that God has invested in you, that you don't have a spirit of timidity and fear, that you have a spirit of courage and of love. And go out there and trust God. And he basically is telling his own testimony in our reading for today. That Paul says, I have decided to lean into Christ and to trust him completely, and what I've discovered is he's faithful. So he's encouraging Timothy, don't give up, finish well. So Paul was someone who, early on in his life, he was someone who you'd think started very well. At least from a religious sense, he started really well. He grew up in the right family with the right connections, ended up going to Jerusalem to study under the best teacher, and he was apparently one of the best students in his class. He started really well in his life. But that sense that he had everything right and that everything was going the way that he could look at himself and feel like he was better than other people was actually putting him on a path that was going to lead him in the wrong direction. Until finally he had an encounter with Jesus. And as he encountered Jesus, he came to realize what he thought was a good start was actually not the most helpful start. What he discovered was if you kept on depending upon his own resume, that pile of blocks that he was building, that it was going to fall over and he wasn't going to finish well. But he came to the point in life where he said, I'm willing to just put all those blocks away so that I can depend on the one who will help me finish well. From this point on, I consider all those things worthless compared to knowing Christ, to trusting in him, to trusting in the power of the Spirit in my life. So Paul was someone who you'd think because he started well, he was going to finish well just because of his own qualifications. But he discovered that he wouldn't finish well just because of his own qualifications. So as I turned 50, I guess you always have times that you're evaluating your life, but turning 50 is another one of those times where I want to look at my life and see, I want to finish well. And I want to evaluate and see, am I heading in a direction where I'm going to finish well? That what Paul discovered was that when his life was about him, he wouldn't have been able to finish well. But when his life was about Christ, he knew he would finish well. That when it was all about doing things for God and to impress other people, he knew he wasn't going to finish well. But as he opened up his life for God's love to transform him so that God could work through him to bless other people, he knew he would finish well. And when it was all about people being impressed by all the amazing things he was doing, he knew that he wasn't going to finish well. But when it was about love, as we read in 1 Corinthians 13, that we can do all kinds of amazing things, but all of it's worthless if we don't love. So Paul is reflecting on how do we finish well. And that brings us to our gospel reading for today. That we have two people, one of them who started really well, at least in a religious sense, the Pharisee. But what the Pharisee thought was it was all about him. Basically, he was talking to himself, patting himself on the back in front of God rather than talking to God. He wasn't leaning into God. He wasn't trusting God. He was just trusting himself. He was doing things to impress other people rather than to love other people. You can see that in just the way he spoke. He's not using his faith to build up other people. He's using his faith to build himself up and cut other people down. And what does Jesus say is going to be the end result of that way of living? This man went home disconnected from God. But what about the other man? The one who maybe didn't start well, the tax collector who had compromised and probably had been dishonest. His lifestyle probably ended up hurting people rather than loving people. But he came to a place where he didn't want to keep going that direction. He came to a place where he decided, I need to stop depending upon myself to make my life work. I need to depend upon God. So he ended up seeking, God, I don't want me anymore, I want you. I don't want to do things to build myself up. I want to do things to build other people up. I want my life to be known by the way I build people up rather than by the way I cheat people. And as he confesses his sin to God, what does Jesus say about his status as he heads home? He goes home connected. He goes home in a direction where he can finish well. So I just want to invite you to take time this week to look at where you're at in your life. Whether you started well, like the Pharisee, where you tithe every week and you do everything right and you're always impressing people by what you do, that's not what you can depend upon. Because you can start that way, and if it causes you to not lean into Christ, seeking to know him more, you might not finish well. And it might be time to evaluate what you're living for. Are you living for yourself or you're living for him? Or if you come here today feeling like you've screwed up your life and you're so far behind that you're not going to be able to finish well. God doesn't treat us according to our past. He treats us according to his purposes in our lives as we lean into him and trust him. So, just want to invite you to take time to think. Am I on a path to finishing well? And it really doesn't have anything to do with whether we started well or we started poorly. It just depends upon who we're focusing on now. Are we living our life for him or for ourselves? It depends upon whether we are doing things for God to impress God and impress other people, or whether we're opening up our lives and saying, God, I want you to use my life to bless other people. that really the ultimate goal in life is not that we have built ourselves up so that when we die, people are impressed with us. But the whole point is that by the time we're done, that we have elevated everybody around us. Because that's what it's about. All the things that we do are worthless if they don't lift up other people in love. So I want to invite you to take time to ask God to help you to get back on track if you're not headed toward finishing well. Amen.